All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful fall evening. This is sort of the first online artist interview as part of the UNmaker series, which is a research project as part of my thesis, PhD thesis, from unsettling to unmaking, and investigating how as creative practitioners we can help unmake harm and bring forward gestures of care and repair. So I'd just like to start with a brief land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that I am a cis white settler female, currently living in Barrie, Ontario, which is in Simcoe County, and that I sit in front of a screen on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people, the Anishinaabe including the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as Three Fires Confederacy, whose local bands of the Beausoleil First Nation, Georgian Island First Nation, and Rama First Nation make up the Chippewa Tri-Council. This is one of few councils from across the vast country that was finally granted reparations in 2012 for the unjust dispossession of their land and displacement of their communities from the Coldwater's Narrows Reserve. What this history has taught me is that regardless of the treaties upon which our towns and cities have been built, one cannot assume that those treaties were fair, agreed upon, or have been upheld by the multiple levels of government that govern as ceded and unceded land. And just to start with a lovely intro to Dr. Michelle Wilson. She is an artist and a mother, currently residing as an uninvited guest on Treaty 6 territory in London, Ontario. Successfully defending her Shirkanoa GS-funded PhD in May 2022 at Western University. As a feminist of settler descent studying in colonial institutions, Wilson's dissertation investigated the confronted the Euro-American archive and how the bodies of other animals are used to convey colonial knowledge systems, with their stories of survival used to perpetuate myths of settler saviors. Having also received grants from the Manitoba Arts Council and the Ottawa Arts Council for her research creation projects, Wilson is a contributing editor with Embassy Cultural House and a lead researcher for Guardianship and State and the Center for Sustainable Curating at UWO, whose exhibition highlights include Museum London, the Macintosh Gallery, Goldsmith University, the Platform Center for Photographic and Digital Arts, and the City of Ottawa Art Gallery. Michelle's ongoing projects include leading the Coves Collective, a group of art activists engaged in actions on the land that challenge ideas of ownership and conservation, and that is spearheading the Remediating Soils Project, an interdisciplinary working group creatively responding to the idea of soil as a relational medium. So thank you, Michelle, for agreeing to do this interview and taking the time out from your busy schedule as a scholar and mother.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm very interested in your framing of these discussions as I'm making, so good to be a part of that.
Thanks. And I would also like to take the time to congratulate on your PhD and a very powerful culminating exhibition, what I actually had the privilege to travel to London and see, which was called Remnants, Outlaws, and Wallows, Practices for Understanding Bison. So I was wondering if, beginning the interview, if you could actually fill in some details for some of us who have joined in this evening about your thesis, and then share if there was anything you had to unmake about yourself or the way you were doing things to finally arrive and complete your research, because the subject matter is quite sensitive, and I understand that you also had to interact with communities that is also very sensitive. So I wonder if you could just introduce us to your thesis work.
Okay, I'll share my screen. I don't know how, but my most recent notes to your questions did not save, so I might have to wait it out.
I'm sure you know exactly what you've been working on for the last few years. Yeah.
So are you seeing the slideshow?
Yes, we are. Yeah, you might just want to put it to full screen.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's gonna mess up my other screen. It's not liking that.
Here, perfect.
I can't see my notes. I might just have to X out of it, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, I still want to be able to see my notes. So I think the most interesting thing about my dissertation and the way that I approached it was the central structure, where I looked at the forced migration of bison throughout Turtle Island, starting in the 1870s when 5 calves were taken after a hunt and brought back to Winnipeg. From those 5, they were their descendants were shuttled around from Stony Mountain Penitentiary to the Texas Panhandle in Kansas, to the Flathead Reservation in Montana, and then into Alberta, and then up into Wood Buffalo National Park. So following the bison through space and time, both structured, I think, this core element of my dissertation, and also the artwork that you're seeing over here. I wanted to create a narrative dissertation because one of my favorite things to listen to, and actually was really inspiring to me, was a hilarious podcast called Witch Please. And they talk about Harry Potter of all things. But they talk about how those texts are enacting theory and looking at it through different lenses. And I think bison stories, and as a way to think about conservation, really demonstrate how theory is materialized in space and in bodies, and how it structures the material world, and vice versa. So I thought about using the stories of these bison both affectively and as a way to materialize critical theory. And actually at a workshop that Jill and I were at together, someone suggested thinking about it through the prism of fictocriticism. And that really resonated with me. I had already started the work, but at least it gave me language to understand what I was doing.
I'm sorry, so can you say that word again? Sorry.
Fictocriticism.
Ficto, okay. You want to explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's, part first person narrative, part speculative fiction, and then also informed by critical theory. And it describes it as traced by numerous voices which work now in unison, at other times in counterpoint, and others still against each other in deliberate discord. It is an act of defiance, an attempt to exercise the paralyzing interdictions of disciplinary academic authority. And she describes it as a kind of haunted writing. And that idea of these stories being haunted by the white settler men who wanted to create this myth of themselves as saviors, but also haunted by the bison themselves. And then I also think about these moments of rupture where things could have been done differently, but we felt it was so inevitable to follow this one view of conservation or of protection. And then we're haunted by all the potentials that we could never have that we never arrived at. And so I think those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to evoke in the writing.
So maybe I'll just sort of at the end of my first very long and dense question.
Oh yeah, what did I have to unmake?
Was there something about yourself that you needed to unmake in order to take this sort of ficto-criticism up, or allow other voices and perspectives in, or?
That's the one. Let different voices and perspectives in. I came to my PhD work out of my MFA, and my MFA was very much concerned with like just relations with other beings and animals. And so it was my first time, I think, really seriously delving into this kind of academic theoretical work. And I went down the line or the history of critical animal theory from like Animal Liberation Front in the UK on. And, you know, a lot of those writers and theorists are, you know, take an almost Kantian approach to kind of trying to rationalize us out of unjust relationships with animals. You see it developing more into like an ethics of care, but it still remains centered in this like very white Eurocentric perspective. And as much as I think a lot of those theorists would say that they are not dogmatic, they, I think, definitely are, and that that they can only imagine just relations in one way, and that is humans avoiding being in contact with other animals, doing no harm, and it's such a limiting perspective. And so to understand how hunting can be part of being in good relation with other beings, those kind of things like that, like viscerally, conceptually was something I really had to unmake in myself and identify the white supremacy that was structuring those perspectives. They're very selective.
It's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, understanding that you can hunt and kill in a respectful way. Yeah, that would be, yeah, interesting. That there's other ways to do it that are more in tune with the land and the animals.
Yeah, and that those relationships have evolved over millennium, and they are relationships of care. And yeah, that care can look in that way. And that I think that there is this like idea of separating humans from other animals, that we could somehow be outside of these relationships of life and death. And it is just such a privileged place of not seeing the extensions of harm beyond the obvious, right? So
yeah.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that you had heard of this term called fictocriticism with Dr. Rachel Buller, which I was also going to mention that the first time I met you was during that, what I consider an amazing writing workshop, and it really catapulted or helped to extend my practice as well. And so what we were asked to do in that workshop was do a lot of speculative writings, write to the past, write to the present, and write a letter to the future. And although speculative writing can be historically informed, like I know I've been using my ecological research to inform my speculative writing, you were using your research into the archives, right? As well as, I guess, studying the bison to inform your speculative writing. So can you speak to how writing from a bison's perspective helped to unmake your outlook on animals, the land, art, or any other preconceptions you had about Canada's history? And I know you've just touched on it a little bit in terms of hunting, but I just wonder if that speculative writing also unmade something else within yourself and your research.
I think there are so many ways I could answer that question, but the point that it made me think of was that when I approached writing from the perspective of a bison, so many of these stories are about calf capture and separation of that maternal bond. And I began writing those stories shortly after giving birth to my daughter. And it was in that postpartum period that I really became aware of how powerful hormones are in that maternal relationship. And when I read about the panic and the struggle and the suffering of these cows when they were separated from their calves, that was what resonated so powerfully with me. I was just going to read a quote that came out of that archival research.
Sure.
So I wrote, "The calves refused buckets of water and called relentlessly and desperately for their mothers. Jones and his men rode out looking for range cows to forcibly milk, but instead found two of the bison mothers wandering the site of their loss. Their udders were full. I feel the echoes of that aching pressure. I feel it because I have known that itching, tingling, let down, and the pain when the release doesn't come. I have felt the surge of hormones that hit like a drug when the baby feeds. Sometimes when I just thought about the baby feeding. I share those hormones with these cows. They don't make my connection to my child any less, but they make my empathy with these mothers real. Jones could never understand the bond of milk. It was just another resource to take, another inconvenience to overcome.
Mm. And Joan, can you just clarify who Jones was for us?
Yeah, so he was a rancher in Kansas, and because the bison were in the commons, right? They didn't belong to anyone. He had been a buffalo hunter, and as he saw the numbers dwindling, he saw the opportunity to collect the last of them under his ownership and try and domesticate them, try and gain financially in some way. I think he's kind of one of the most transparent of the self-serving conservationists. So he at first was just going out and collecting calves. Eventually he tried to take the full-grown cows. And that part of the story was so difficult to write because I'm reading his journal entries and journal entries by people who accompanied him on these expeditions to capture the cows. And the detail is graphic, and I think, you know, it's a survival story, but for me,
Yeah.
I did not put myself in his shoes. I put myself in their shoes. And
yeah.
Yeah, so that piece in the audio work, I think I explained that properly. The piece that you see in the background here, the gray threads are conductive threads. So when the viewer touched them, an audio story played. A version of one of these longer chapters in my dissertation was kind of, I worked with a poet, Seal Englert, to make them into like effective pieces of prose. And then my partner, Angus, created soundscapes to go with them. So when the viewer touched the piece, it would play that section of the journey, the little essay that went with it.
Now, I don't have this as a question, but I think we're looking at this sort of stuffed bison here. Am I correct in saying you actually returned this to the land? Or
so I had two bison. There were two bison that I worked with, their actual remains. One of them I was able to purchase the taxidermy bison head, and I deconstructed it. And that robe I gifted through a performance with Casey Adams, and she now use that in her own performance and her teachings. This one, however, is from the Manitoba Museum. They allowed him to come on loan to London, and they allowed me to put him in this installation, I guess, on his back on this specially constructed plinth. He would usually be, you know, in that trophy position on the wall. He's directly related to the stories in the piece, the forced migration piece, because after Jones collected the bison in Texas and brought them to Kansas, he eventually folded, and he sold his bison to a rancher on the Flathead Reservation who owned a small herd there. So they were kind of all amalgamated together, and eventually the Flathead Reservation was opened up, and their land illegally sold to white settlers, and allotment was forced upon them. So the Canadian government agreed to buy the bison because as the land was getting split up, they wouldn't have the free range of the whole reservation, the protection of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. So they loaded, again, another forced migration. They were loaded up onto train cars and sent to Alberta. But the bulls, these older bulls, were just too big, too wild to be forced into this. And they refused. And so about a dozen of them were shot. They called them the outlaw bison. And I kind of love that because it marks their resistance. And this one was found in Winnipeg in an office of the city hall, and then donated to the Manitoba Museum. And they did a bunch of work recently and uncovered his history and his identity and things like that. So that was kind of how I found out about him, and then asked for him to come and join the piece at Museum London. And then I wrote and recorded his story as well.
I'm liking how you're still referring to him as an animate object, not animate being.
Yeah.
And that the stories are sort of keeping him and his resistance, refusal alive. That's
it's hard not to get lost in all the things that are not him. Like the form is not him, the eyes are not him. But, his, some of his remains, his story are still there. When he was unloaded in the space, it was such a emotional moment to come out of this crate and think about, being crated up and moved by train. But Adrian Stimson was in that show as well, and he led a smudge and said some words and offered a blessing, and also reflected on his experiences at Wennesquin in Saskatchewan. They have a Indigenous run cultural center, and they have brought bison back there. I don't know if you heard this story, but the bison, in their digging and wallowing after being returned to the land there, uncovered these amazing petroglyphs. And Adrian was there, I think, at that time, doing some paintings and things like that. So because the bison in conservation herds on Turtle Island came from this very shallow gene pool, the bison that he was with there are the descendants of this bison. They're all connected. So it was very powerful to reflect on that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it sounds like this research, and I know this from experience, that there's quite a bit of trauma that you would have been exposed to as a result of sort of forming a bond with these beings, more than human beings. And so I'm just wondering if, you said that there was some reading that it was too painful. So I'm just interested that now your new collaborative project, which is quite literally entitled Remediating Soils. So we've moved on from sort of sharing the narrative storytelling to actually making some repair here. And I'm wondering if it's the exposure to all that trauma, where you needed to, sort of relinquish or remove yourself from that trauma. And just can you talk about the shift, maybe, and even if one informs the other?
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna, but now I can't. Can I play the video?
You can play, yeah.
It's not, it's just some of us starting to work on the land at our pilot site. But that's such an interesting way to frame it, to think about this as being, in some ways, a more productive response to the trauma of these topics and this way of working with other beings. I was really excited about it because working with the bison and trying to tell their stories, they're such a charismatic megafauna. And there was so much to tell, even though I only chose to address this one line of this like very vast story. But a very important part of bison is not just these like impressive, beautiful beings, but that they are engineers of the landscape. And their interactions with soils and seeds and the bacteria in their ruminant stomachs, and how those correspond with like specific ecosystems at specific times. That was so interesting to me, but I really felt like I only scratched the surface. There's an author, Wes Olson. He's a former bison warden, actually, through Parks Canada, but he's also an amazing writer and artist. And he, like, following his knowledge really helped me to be able to write those stories and helped me understand the complexity of relationships with soils. So I was grateful to like switch my attention from something so attention grabbing like the bison to something much quieter but equally complex like soils. So the soil project actually was not my idea. Kate Lawless at Huron had this project, a New Frontiers funded project, to work with soil scientists and farmers to understand soil as a relational medium, and how do you create a soil profile that has that talks about I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the words. Soil not as this like monolithic inert thing, not as a resource, right? But this complex collection that allows life to happen and that has this very long memory. So she had already partnered up with Sunnyview Farm, which is a biodynamic farm near Elsie Craig in Ontario. And it's just, yeah, it's so powerful to be able to spend years looking at this one site and knowing the animals that live there and eat there and defecate there, and the plants that grow, and give that really focused attention. We have gotten to know multiple generations of caretakers of that land. And the farmers who were on the land before the current farmers are this German couple that came over to start this biodynamic farm and find a way to caretake the land without private ownership. So in a way, the land is owned by Rose. It's like a soil care trust. So that like undoing farmers as private landowners was part of their idea. And then also they're incredibly attuned to place and poetic. So that's been great. And then we've been working with Ed Gregorich and Henry Jansen, who are soil scientists who are also poets. So there's a lot to gather from them and to respond to their stories. So yeah,
so it's I really think that's interesting that you said undoing this idea of land to be owned, or land ownership in terms of agriculture. So do they speak about the commons when, in trying to do this, or does a land trust fall into our understanding or definition of the commons, or is it quite different as still?
Yeah, it's not what we would call the commons. I guess it's more like it's administered by a board.
Okay.
But
and not everyone has access to it, is that correct? Like,
no,
could I walk on it and farm?
No.
Yeah, okay. So there's still some level of ownership, just not by an individual per se.
Yeah, and I think that they have been looking at other models, but I think as small scale farmers, they're preoccupied in survival mode a lot of the time and keeping the farm going. But I know that is a long-term goal.
Mhm.
Good night. Love you.
Good night.
Yeah. Yeah. Good night.
If you don't follow Michelle on Instagram, all of her cool art projects are equally met by adorable photos of her child.
Oh, yeah, I don't know what the ratio is. It's probably 10% art, 90% kid.
Okay, let's see where we're at. So my question number 5 was, can you give an example of how projects like these are helping to make either colonial, capitalist, and industrial approaches to land? And so maybe you can just talk a little bit more about that. Are there approaches to land less industrial within the land trust? Like, are they avoiding using pesticides or?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I'll just pull up this picture while I'm starting to think about it. I'm not like the best expert on biodynamic farming. It is a very interesting mix of organic farming practices and spiritualism. They're definitely trying to build a circular kind of ecosystem within farming. They're using animals to prep and fertilize fields. There's a lot of rotation happening. An interesting thing that Alex and Eleanor, the German farmers who were stewarding land before this, they looked at encouraging wildlife corridors to reestablish themselves. So when you look at their farm, it's so drastically different from everything around it. It's not like flat rows and then a windbreak or something like that. There will be, pretty large swaths of forests that have been encouraged to regrow. The land still has a lot of undulation to it. A lot of the time, like alfalfa cover is down or something like that. They're not going down to the soil when they clear their fields. And Alex and Eleanor definitely talk about the fact that when they came to the farm in the 90s, it was a hostile place to other beings. Like the birds didn't come, and that over probably a decade, they just started to see life returning to the farm. And so it's taken them 30 years to get it to where it is now. And they're very conscious of the fact that things could go in a decade, in a decade, everything could be reversed. And the soil scientists, when they have looked at the soil and analyzed it, say like, as far as microbiome health, different things they analyze for, I'm sorry, different markers. The health of the soil in the fields is greater than in the forest, like right beside it. And that's without any like chemical inputs or anything like that. It is a very special place. The Asable River runs through it. So I mean, as an artist, I was thinking about what marks do colonial land practices leave in this place, even after a few decades of these kind of practices. And one of those things was the barbed wire. And it kind of came up organically in my dissertation defense, because I had done this piece about wolves in Riding Mountain National Park and telling the story of these two wolves as they move through the land. And I was really thinking about the warp and weft of woven fabric and all the writing out there about, the immaculate grid of Canada's land allotment systems, and how fabric kind of can reenact these things, or at least are used for as a metaphor. You know, the quilt being so important to settler women's identities, and one of the examiners brought up the idea of barbed wire being a way that was quite literally cut into the land and disrupted all these relationships. And would I think about working with wire or with metal as a way to reference that? Which is not really how I work. I'm not like, oh, I'll work with this material because I want to work in the actual material, and if there's a way to do remediation in that, then that's interesting to me. And so this bug had just been put in my ear, and then I went back to the farm and I noticed so much barbed wire that had been overtaken by the trees. It's coming out of the trees. It's just left in the leaf litter to trip you up. And so I thought, okay, this is something that I can do to be in good relation with this place, is to take this barbed wire out, but that it can also be a productive medium in making this sculpture where I'm putting it in that glass bottle. But also, if I fill the glass bottle with vinegar, I will literally unmake the barbed wire and create an ink or material for dyeing. So that was my plan.
Oh, fascinating. I don't think I knew the extent that you're wanting to unmake it. I think I only knew that you helped to unmake it from these spaces, which, yeah, are ultimately sort of these controlling systems of material. So you're actually hoping to disintegrate it and breathe new value into it. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and we filmed the performance. This is stills from the performance of like gathering the barbed wire and then putting it into the vessel. But then when I went to check it this week, it had been shot. Who knows, by accident. People aren't supposed to be hunting on this land. But that's what it means to be open to the agency of the world and other beings, right? So a big part of maybe I will just put it on full screen because I can't, my notes aren't very good now anyways. A bunch of the vinegar and water still remains in the bottom, and the barbed wire is mostly kept its shape. So it is still doing its work out there in the land. I had hoped to be able to bring it in for a gallery exhibition in 2025. I don't think I'll be able to move it without the whole thing falling apart, but we'll have the documentation and we'll still be able to work with the resolution that's being made there.
So just so you know, I think if you wanted to show that a brief snip of the other video, it does work when you're on full screen, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's us digging a pit.
Okay. Maybe we don't need to see you.
It's not the most artistic thing. It was just a site visit with the soil scientists. They are making actual soil profiles. So you can see the different soil strata in the fields, and they're very good at animating it and helping you understand the stories that what the depths mean, and what different geological eras, what it tells you about how the land was first plowed.
Wow.
So it's very interesting. I am making mini versions now since I probably won't be able to bring that into the gallery. Actually where I set it up, where I set that big bottle up, was I think the dump for the old farm, probably the farm. 60 years. I mean, there's no plastics, right? So this was a long time ago that was probably the trash pit. And now it's been covered over for many years, and all the glass is getting pushed up out of the soil. And so I've collected quite a few of these like very beautiful antique bottles that came right out of the land right there. And so I'm doing mini versions of the rust solution, and those will be available for me and other people who want, if they're interested in using them.
Interesting. Great. So I wonder if you can clarify or just sort of I don't know, tell us why you think paying more attention to soil as part of Canada's journey into and through truth and reconciliation is, you know, something we really need to be thinking about collectively.
Just had some names here, that's why I wanted to double check. Okay, yes, now I remember what I would say. I think that one of the important things that this project altogether, and then they will have 3 different sites that have very different relationships to land use, and colonialism. But one of the important things I think it does is it draws attention to different modes of relating to soils, ones that are outside of extractionist models, that understand soil as an inert resource that we can just wring as much out of as we can and then input with chemicals to prop it up. And it helps, it is, I am aided in understanding soil by Chloe Dragonsmith's writing on Land with a capital L. She wrote an article for Briar Patch magazine where she defines land and by an extension soils as something that encompasses peoples, cultures, languages, and knowledges. And so I think this project can work towards conveying that understanding of land and place and soil. And then I was also thinking about, I recently heard an address by Elder Liz Stevens. She's from Kettle and Stony Point First Nations. And actually she was speaking at an event that Amanda hosted. And that she noted that agriculture defined under colonialism is not neutral from a Haudenosaunee perspective. And that to speak of agriculture as it's practiced now is to speak of a loss of relations to the land practiced by her people since time immemorial. It's to speak about dispossession, and at the same time, it is to speak about the earth providing us with what we need to sustain life. So yeah, as a settler, I want to make space for and center these voices. But also in my own work, I want to confront the systems of exploitation and colonialism that still operate in my name. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you know, I think it's one of those things that sort of was really hard hitting, is to understand how co-opted and then in turn complicit we are to these things continuing. Yeah, so it's always something to just always reflect on. Okay, so question number 7. As artists, if we choose to recognize how modes of consumption, production, presentation, discard, and dissemination contribute to and perpetuate these anthropogenic perspectives or colonial capitalist industrial perspectives and gestures towards land, what do artists, what do we need to unmake, relinquish, resist, refuse, or refrain if we are to be part of the solution and not the problem? How do we break the cycle?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that it needs to start from a place of humility, that we don't need to understand our legacy as creating things that physically outlast us as artists, and that if the materials that you're using do that, then you are responsible for that legacy and you have to take that very seriously. But for me, it's so much more interesting to allow the agency of materials to become part of the work instead of to struggle against it or try to ignore it. And though, you know, I love making things, I'm not trying to work towards a state of mastery, if that means that I have to execute my vision to perfection, and that excludes the possibility of other agencies making themselves palpable or felt, because I think, in those slippages of intention, that's where we can understand the agency of other beings.
Well, I think this barbed wire project is a perfect example of how you have unmade something first in order to make something, right? So there's this process of removing that and gathering and healing of those spaces, and then you shift into the reconfiguration or reimagining or in this case disintegration of that which was causing harm. So I think it's a perfect example of how if we find what's already existing and undo the distance from its potential or its agency in terms of creating something new, I think it's a great example.
Yeah,
because it can become an ink, right? It can become a drawing material or painting material. Yeah.
I was going to share this work that I made I've been working on collaboratively with Paul Chartrand. There it goes. So this is part of the Coves Collective work, and the Coves Collective operate out of a site that was once a paint factory next to an apple orchard that is kind of contained in this oxbow that used to connect with the Deshkenzidi. The paint factory left around 2000, but very little to no remediation work has been done. And actually the paint company, Sherwin-Williams, still owns the land, but are like an absentee owner. And so it's really a space that's been reclaimed by human and more than human communities. And so we've been thinking about this space, and some funds came available through Guardianship and State through their SHIRK funding to do community engaged art programming. And so Paul came up with this idea to create a living phytoremediation text. The most successful part of it is this O. It was supposed to spell SOS, but we underestimated how difficult it was going to be to cut into the concrete. So the O is really what ended up being the focal piece. And Paul did some research and realized that goldenrod is a naturally occurring plant in this place that also remediates lead. And just to backtrack, I got interested in this site because I noticed people foraging blackberries there right along the fence line where the paint factory was. And I was like, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea. And I didn't know that much of the history of the place, but I went to a biologist at Western and I said, can we test these berries for heavy metals? And she said, yes. Sheila McPhee, and it came back, they were very high in lead.
Wow.
So yeah, so this project's been a few years percolating in my mind. So Paul and I installed the O with the goldenrod, and then we build a cairn in the center of the broken concrete that's just littered all over the property. And then it became a site that we visited once a week to caretake and water, especially with the drought that we had this summer, and to talk about the history of this place and to look around at, all the abundance of goldenrod already occurring there naturally that's doing this important work. Yeah, and it was a good little
and so many people they're allergic to goldenrod, right? So
that's ragweed. So that's ragweed.
Oh, that's ragweed.
Yeah. It's the when plants have a cousin.
Okay.
Or they look like one another and only one is actually harmful.
Okay. Yeah. But we will indiscriminately remove the cousin because we think it's but in fact we need it. It's doing work that we can never imagine or do, right, without it. So yeah, it's we need to unmake our assumptions about what's actually
Weeds,
happening.
yeah. The weeds
Yeah.
are doing such important work. Yeah.
So we are at 7:53, and I really do want to allow people to ask any questions, and then maybe and add to the discussion. But I do have a couple more questions, but maybe we can come back to that. You know what? I'm going to hit you up with one more question, because I'm pretty sure this is as important a question to you and Amanda and myself. You know, in that we're moving to sort of these land-based practices, and like, where's the money? How do we survive? So my question is, like, what needs to change or be undone a little bit about the way the art world works, and its larger supportive institutions and systems, if we are to encourage other artists to take up and sustain practices of care and repair? Like, there is a reality to choosing to make this way and resist our capitalist system that ultimately threatens our own survival. And so, and you know, you're lucky enough to be involved with some shirk projects, myself as well as Amanda, but this funding is not plentiful or accessible, and the council sure as hell can't. I swore in our interview, but the councils can't support, you know, all the artists who need to be supported to do this sort of very ephemeral work that escapes capitalist consumption. So I wonder if you've been thinking about how the art world needs to change to support this.
Yeah. I wish I had a better answer. I mean, the answer to me is just housing as a human right and a minimum income. And then everyone would be artists because they would have time to be creative in their lives. Yeah, I think that when I look at the shirk projects that I've been involved with recently, I'm very happy about the ways we've been able to creatively redistribute funds within the community. So that's kind of inspiring. I would love to see more of that happening, right? Not hoarding all the wealth within the institution, but like, how can we spread the fingers of that wealth that comes from the privilege of being in the institution to our community partners? Yeah, I know that I will never be well off, but if I could just have the stability to get from one project to the next, I would be happy, because nothing that I do is saleable, and even to often it doesn't even wind up in the gallery either. So exhibition funding, that kind of thing, you have to be really creative about how to get it, and I've been so successful. Yeah, but I'm not sure I have a long-term sustainable plan for that. Have good partners, have good friends.
I know the Canada Council I think they've started to make some changes, and I believe environmentalism has come into their agenda to some degree. So that's interesting. But again, right, the amount of artists out there versus the amount of Canada Council funding, it doesn't measure up. Okay.
And actually we did get a bit of funding for the remediating soils project to do that first year of research. Paul Chartrand is also working on that project, just a little bit from the London Arts Council. So it really is drips and drabs from different places and trying to,
which is more labor, right? It's the labor that goes into that. Yeah.
And then my works are not typically very expensive to produce, but very expensive in time. Do you mind if I share a little bit about the third project that I'm doing?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Will they answer any of the questions, or do you just think
Oh,
we're
is there a
gonna?
question? Oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
did come up with,
Go.
oh,
Where?
I had a long answer to, oh, it might have been, I don't know. Oh, what legally needs to change
Yes, yeah.
relates to the land. Yeah.
So besides artists and other creative designers, who else needs to be unmaking past ways of relating to the land to move forward in not only a respectful and sustainable way, but also in a legal way? And I asked that question in that I'm very familiar with UNDRIP and UN rights, sovereignty rights for Indigenous communities, and how ultimately Canada's breaking laws every day. So that's where that question came from.
Okay, I'll bring up this slide then. So I think about in conservation work, especially how the settler colonial mentality orders our relationship to the land. And through my research for my dissertation work, I was looking at wood buffalo, and I came across that article by Chloe Dragonsmith in Briarpatch, which I can't recommend enough. But she lives on the land and with the land with her partner in Wood Buffalo National Park on their traditional territory. And bison hunting has been banned there for over a century. And still access to the park and access to trap lines, traditional hunting territories is still controlled by Parks Canada. They still have a very contentious relationship with the superintendent there. And something that came up when consulting with Chloe about writing the section about wood buffalo was the fact that while Parks Canada banned Indigenous peoples from practicing their life ways and providing for their families, they not only stole their children to send to so-called residential schools, but they were slaughtering bison and selling that meat to residential schools and the apartheid Indian hospitals. So this like policy of, sorry, I'm getting flustered. This policy of making dependency as a way to clear people off the land and claim it. It's all tied together with this land policy, right? So Chloe connected me to the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership that's hosted out of the University of Guelph, but has partners across Turtle Island, well, across Canada, I would say, not so much, I think, in the United States. And so we started talking about this, that like really any mention of the Parks Canada working with the missions and earmarking meat in this way is really only mentioned in like footnotes in passing and things like that. And it's really not something that's, I think, understood. And it is something that clearly illustrates the relationship between conservation regimes and land theft. And so we wanted to look at that more and tell that story. And then I got connected with the CRP, and I'm so inspired by the work they're doing. I got brought on as a postdoctoral scholar to work with them. And I think that IPCA's Indigenous protected and conserved areas are this incredible opportunity to practice natural law, Indigenous sovereignty without permission and a way to claim it, and build also an economic relationship with the land in a good way for Indigenous communities. And these partnerships are finding ways to make that happen for communities that are looking for that support. So I'm very excited to be working with them, and we're thinking about an exhibition with the Art Gallery of Guelph also in 2025, where we will partner where we will partner artists with IPCAs or Parks Canada to either respond to the conservation relationships through art that are being advanced in IPCAs, or in my case, you know, having a real critical look at the past and restoring that, and hopefully arriving at a new way moving forward.
Mhm. And I know that the National Park System actually has their own truth and reconciliation mandate and agenda in terms of how to redress national and provincial sites. And I know it started in some areas, and I believe Ursula Johnson actually was it in 2017, that huge landmarks project, 2017, I believe she actually held a moose feast out east, where the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities came together and feasted on moose together in an area where it had very much been contentious, where about the moose hunt. There was the non-Indigenous community was not allowed to hunt moose at certain times, but the Indigenous community was. And so Ursula sort of created this feast in order to sort of build good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous community through sharing. So I think that was a really interesting action there that helps to heal some, you know, dissent that is coming, because we are starting to redress these spaces, and so it's causing contention in larger publics who just don't understand, you know, why those why things are changing, you know, the way we need to all sort of take it up and embrace it. So
yeah. I think specifically about the wood buffalo context is that the displaced communities are still asking for an apology from Parks Canada. So I think that the truth aspect of this is still a place where a lot of work needs to be done. And so I think this like creative approach to archival research could be quite valuable there. But yeah.
For me, the key thing is, so here I am what I am in my own skin. How can I now proceed with integrity and honesty? Not making things worse, not just keeping the status quo, but contributing to better relationship. And I would like to see more inquiry into that, more conversation about how that could possibly happen.
Yeah, I think for me, like in the Cove's work that I was talking about personally, that's where I see that kind of productive work being modeled, because it starts in care work. It was very much a settler and Indigenous people collaboration of sharing of knowledge through those different workshops on the land, but also an opportunity in the same moment that we're doing this care work to talk about this deep and contested past.
Yeah, move beyond the harm, the traumatic history to, yeah, there's.
And we didn't have to heal everything, but we could heal something in that moment.
Yes, doing anything that is, you know, I think, and contributing to anything that is healing or offering care, gestures of care. It doesn't solve everything, but it can help to even just make reparations within yourself, you know, in terms of carrying on that guilt. I read a sort of psychological definition of reparation, and it ultimately said reparation is important for people moving beyond the guilt so that they can get to action, so that they can begin to contribute. So the reparations need to start within ourselves so that we can move forward and make reparations elsewhere, or else we get depressed, no hope, guilt. It can overcome us if we don't make reparations within ourselves. And I feel like just even like understanding that I need to start to unmake myself from some systems or some actions of harm it has been enough of a reparation to move me from a very dark research in my MFA toward a more positive research. So it's 8:22. Thank you for sharing your references. I've written them all down.
Yep.
The meeting ends at 8:30. So what I would I would like to end by thanking all of you for coming, for Michelle being willing to share time and research with us, expand our understanding what unmaking can mean. I'd also like to thank the MacLaren Art Centre. They have sponsored this Zoom series, so ask and you shall receive, right? Because we have to find creative ways around all of those expenses. And I think I'd like, if it's okay, Michelle, I'd like to end with one question where maybe you share any books, essays, blog, or podcasts you would recommend to help others sort of unmake themselves from the blinders that have been cast on us, or from very much putting the human at center of things. If there's any resources you'd like to share.
There's a book called Plants, People, and Places, The Roles of Ethnobotany and Ethnoecology in Indigenous Peoples, Land Rights in Canada and Beyond. I'll put it in the chat. It's a mouthful, by Nancy Turner. It's a great book, but Nancy Turner also helped organize a series of talks called the Reconciling Ways of Knowing series. I think almost all of their roundtables are available online on their website, and they are so inspiring and eye-opening. David Suzuki is one of the conveners or questioners on them, and they're just such a fount of knowledge. The Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership has so many resources. They have a section called the Knowledge Basket, where you can collect the resources that you've looked at or that were important to you, but lots of videos, lots of language teachings. And then I was thinking about the podcast called Threatened. It mostly focuses on connections between birds and landscapes, but in season 1, they have an episode 5, about Thai Denenene, and what it took for the Lutsekay First Nation to be able to establish an IPCA in partnership with Parks Canada. And I think it's like a pretty realistic narration of what it took for the people there to overcome mistrust and be able to establish that. Yeah, and then I always recommend Witch Please to everyone I meet, because I've taken so many high-level seminars on theory, and yet these two amazing feminist scholars talking about Harry Potter breaks down like Foucault in a way that anyone can understand.
And you spell witch like as in like a wicked witch?
Yeah, like witch, comma, please. Hannah McGregor. Hannah McGregor just came out with a book called A Sentimental Education. It's also available as an audiobook, and I love audiobooks so much. And I think it is also an amazing meditation on affect and the work of white women and our relationships to colonialism. It's incredibly thoughtful and a great, great audiobook.
Okay, so I lied because we've got 4 minutes left and I'm just going to end. So we're doing a lot of reading and listening of Indigenous ways of knowing and stories and beliefs and practices. So how do you suggest that people who want to respect this and work alongside it, how do they make themselves from appropriating it?
Mm.
So
Oh,
how do
no.
we how do we support it and listen to it and yet not extract it?
That was the other book I wanted to recommend, and I'm blanking on the author's name. Hungry Listening is the name of the book.
Oh, Dylan Robinson.
Dylan Robinson, yes. And I've really been thinking about that because just
Well, one of the ways is you're collaborating, like to
Oh, for me.
collaborate.
Yeah.
Collaboration is one way that you've been able to mediate that slippery slope, right?
And it's never perfect, and it's definitely not to say that that's not contentious or difficult, that those are smooth, relationships all the
Yeah.
time. But I think it's the only way to move forward if we're making work that acknowledges that there are multiple ways of knowing and multiple perspectives. I cannot inhabit all those things and communicate them. I can only communicate from my own embodied perspective. And so, yeah, to me, I don't think I'll ever have a solo show because I need that multiplicity of voices. And I even feel uncomfortable, being the overarching name in that collectivity. I want that to be shared and lateral. But yeah, the idea of hungry, how to not be a hungry listener, because we all are reading with our highlighter, for those important phrases that you might need to reference and quote later. And that is the extractivist mentality that he's warning us against. If we're really listening with our entire being and body, and not for what we can mine from things, then that is not the way to approach the writing of these authors and knowledge keepers. So it's something, that I need to remind myself of often.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And just again, thanks to everyone who's come this evening. Our next talk will be on Thursday, November 17th with Sharon Callis. And again, I would like to thank the MacLaren Art Centre for the sponsorship of the program, as well as the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for the support of this research, as well as Queen's University. Thank you, everyone.